Okay, we have a lot to talk about tonight, so I'd like to just start off by asking a couple of questions. How many of you have ever heard me speak? Raise your hand. Good. How many of you have heard me speak in person? YouTube, internet, webinars? Okay, good. Okay, right. Okay, good. So how many of you don't know who I am? Who the heck is she? Okay, good. Okay, that's a good place to start. So tonight we're going to be talking, of course, about incredible subjects. Some hidden things that are going on the planet that really tend to indicate that we have a vast history behind us, a history most people know very little about. And in fact, we're just in the process, even those of us who are on the leading edge, of discovering what these are. Antarctica is part of this equation, but it's only part of it. And so this presentation, like the one tomorrow night, is about 250 slides. It is a lot of slides. So we're going to, I'm going to give you a little thermonuclear brain meltdown, but I'm sure you'll be able to keep up because you're so smart out there. After all, you are Dolores' audience. And she was very famous for doing that herself. So we're going to be talking about the evidence for advanced civilizations on the planet prior to the one that we've all been living in. What do the ancients say about this? And we're going to be looking at anomalous evidence that tends to indicate that actually this world and human evolution is much older than what it is that we think. But I'm going to take about 5 or 6 minutes to really talk about myself. I'm a clairvoyant. I've been a clairvoyant since I was a little girl. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up across from a great forest, and I began to have experiences as a child with interdimensional beings. I'm the author of 3 separate books, and each one of these is its own story. The book I'll speak for a moment about Dialogues with the Angels. This was my first book, and I've only probably got 9 of them left downstairs. I didn't bring a lot of books for the conference because it's a lot to haul from Atlanta. This book really begins when I'm a child, and I begin to see these elemental devic spirits in the forest. How many of you have seen that or felt that or know about divas or elementals? They're like the guardian angels of the plant kingdom. And I think that most humans can't see them, and so they were surprised that I could see them. So they told the overlighting angel of that forest to come and talk to me. So when I was 8 years old, this male angel came and began to speak to me about the vast chain of being and how the light and the sound of God are stepped down through the dimensions to eventually come into the 3rd dimension, the concrete world. Well, that made perfect sense to me. Doesn't that make sense to you guys, that it's all vibration? I was like, okay, sure, this sounds good. So growing up, I grew up in one of those great American dysfunctional, households. How many of you relate to that? Yeah. My family was traditionally Christian. My dad was a Baptist, my mother was a Methodist, and we became Episcopalian. And I was actually confirmed at the age of 13. But my dad had been a military man. He was a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and he was like a John Wayne kind of man. He pitched in the minor leagues, he ran track, he flew planes, but he had a massive stroke when he was 37. And so that pretty much wiped it out for him, and he fell into alcoholism. So he became, unfortunately, although he was very brilliant and very moral, we saw the worst of him. He became a very abusive alcoholic, and my poor little strong mother just tried to hold it together. And so my 2 sisters and I, we grew up in this. So we all had different coping mechanisms. And mine was to take long walks at night under the stars and rant and rave to God about the unfairness of life. And why is there suffering? Can any of you relate to that? So I found that there was this divine presence that was walking by my side that would always ask me questions that would counsel compassion, basically, and help me to come back to a place of forgiveness. And so I did a lot of praying growing up that someone wiser than myself would show up to help me explain why one night I would be in the temples of golden wisdom with masters having experience. The next night I'd be in the bowels of the lower astral plane, sitting on piles of dead bodies. The next week I would be visiting with positive extraterrestrials on board ships. It was like, okay, how does this gift work? How do you steer this? And with my clairvoyance, I would look at people as a child and I'd be flooded with information about them. Sometimes I'd try to see stuff and I couldn't see stuff. How many of you can relate to that? Well, so I was trying to get a grip on my gift. So when I was 19 years old, a group of masters appeared to me called the Viragi. Now, the word Viragi comes from the Sanskrit word virag, which means detachment. So these are masters that have detached from the world. They're not married. They're not looking for money, fame, sex, none of that, okay? They're interested in spiritual enlightenment, and they had literally traveled through the dimensions, and they had a roadmap to these dimensions. So when I was in school at Florida State University, where I graduated, these masters appeared to me when I was 19, and they said, we've watched you for many years, we've put you through many tests, and because you've always chosen forgiveness and compassion, we've decided to train you. And so they had something called soul travel, which is the ability each one of us have, if we learn to do it, to shift our consciousness while we're still living in the physical world and to access these higher dimensions. And I was like, that is my kind of path. I don't have to believe something. I don't have to take somebody's word for it. I can find out for myself. And so, you know, in the Clark Kent world, I graduated from school. I became an art director and a commercial photographer. I moved back to Atlanta. I was the first female commercial photographer. I set up a 5,000 square foot studio. I had 5 over the course of about 25 years. I shot for Macy's, IBM, Coca-Cola. I had full-time assistants, part-time assistants, models. That was my life. But my inner world was all about developing these gifts and talents and abilities for my own spiritual enlightenment. And along the way, masters began to appear, angels began to appear. I was taken into halls of wisdom and taught in many great temples in the higher worlds. And so that is what this first book is really about, the dialogues with the angels. And the last third of the book is really the great beings that have been my teachers for the last 30 years. And they are very much the Divine Father and the Divine Mother of creation. And so, this is a very powerful book. Now, this book was my second book. I never in a million years intended to write a book on Jesus, let me just tell you. My older sister is a fundamentalist Christian married to a Presbyterian minister, and they are definitely convinced that all of us are going to hell, okay? In fact, everyone that probably doesn't belong to their church is probably going to hell. I mean, specifically their church. The other Christians don't even get into heaven, just their church. So as you can imagine, this was the last thing I ever intended to take on.